Today, I'll be showing you how to create a loadout selection system, which includes preset loadouts or ones that each player can customize on their own. I'll include a model that contains what I show in this video in the important links section of the description. However, keep in mind that you will still need to change a lot of things inside of it to make sure that it works properly in your game. Now, make sure you have the Explorer and Properties enabled, which can be turned on through the View tab at the top left of the screen. Now hover over the Starter GUI and click the plus button next to it, and then add a Screen GUI inside. Select the Screen GUI, click the plus button on it, and then add a frame into it. This is the visible part of a Screen GUI, which is what we will be using to allow the player to change their loadout and see what they currently have selected. Before you start changing its properties and customizing it, make sure you select the frame and scroll down into the Properties GUI until you see Size. Make sure you open up the arrows until you see it show the scale and offset values for the X and the Y axes. Inside of here, you want to make sure that you set the offset to 0 and that you are only adjusting it based off of scale. So once I've adjusted it to be this way, as soon as I start resizing it or moving it around, it is now just going to be based off of the scale property. The reason why this is important is because if I were to click on this button at the top right here, I can emulate what it will look like on a different size monitor or screen. So when you are using scale, the size of the GUI or the ratio is going to stay relatively the same. But to compare it to the text label at the top left of the screen here, which does not use scale, you'll notice that when I go to a much smaller screen size, it becomes way larger than it should be. However, the Screen GUI or the frame in the center of the screen will remain roughly the same amount of size, and it will take up approximately the same amount of the screen that it would if I was on a 1080p monitor over here or if I was using an iPad Pro. And it's just going to make it a much more enjoyable experience for anyone on any device, since they will be able to see the Screen GUI how it was meant to be seen. Now, select the frame and we can start adjusting it. So I'm going to make it large enough so that I can account for several different things. On the left side of the frame, I want to show what loadout the player currently has selected. Over towards the top, I'm going to have two buttons that are going to allow the player to swap between different kinds of items they can have for their loadout, which is going to be more important for the later part of the video where I showcase a customized loadout that each player can use to choose their own items. And over here towards the center and the right side of the frame, we are going to have the actual loadouts or items that each player is able to select. So I think that this is enough space inside of here for now. So I'm just going to customize it really quick. So if you don't want to see that, you can skip ahead about 10 or 15 seconds. And then we can start adding in the text labels and the text buttons inside and get closer to writing the script. So I've changed the background color to a darker one so that the buttons that we put onto it will stand out more due to the contrast between the lighter and darker colors. And it also matches with the night theme of Studio I have here, so it's just going to be nicer on our eyes. And now I have added a border size pixel of 10, which is going to add this gray border around the frame, and you can change the color of that right here by changing the border color 3. And this is all I'm going to customize it for right now. So you can change whatever you would like, and once you're done with that, we can continue by adding more things inside of the frame. So now select the frame and click the plus button on it. I'm going to add a text label inside, and I'm going to do the same thing when it comes to fixing its size by making sure we are only using scale and not using offset at all. And by default, position already has it set up that way, so we don't need to change that. But make sure to check it just in case something has changed since this video was created. So now I'm going to scroll down inside of the properties and I'm going to select the text scaled option. And that's going to make the size of the text inside of the button scale accordingly depending on how large the button is. And of course there is a point where it doesn't do that anymore, but this is going to be good depending on the size of the monitor or screen that the user is using. And now I'm going to change the text in here to say current loadout, because this is going to indicate that whatever is below it is the current loadout of the player. And then below this, I'm going to have some more text labels that are going to show what loadout they currently have. So I'm going to rename the top one up here to current loadout header, so we know that actually isn't their current loadout. and I'm going to change the one below it to be called Loadout, and I am going to change the text property inside of it to say no loadout selected by default, so the player knows that they have to choose something first. We are going to leave some room down here because when we get to the customized loadouts part of the video, we are going to be showing two different parts of their loadouts so that they can have the ability to know what they have chosen for each one. And from here we can add a folder inside of the frame, and this is just going to be used so that we can organize the elements inside of the GUI so we can reference things much more quickly and know what goes where. Now keep in mind, if you do put something into a folder such as a text label or text button and you try to adjust its size or move it around, you are going to get this error in the output. And that is because it does not have a size or position property when it is inside of a folder. Because a folder is not something physical on the screen that you can see. Because it is parented or inside of the folder, you would need to move these labels back directly into the frame in order to adjust those different properties. So if you end up getting that error, then make sure that you aren't trying to move it around when it is inside of a folder. And of course, it's going to be different for the text properties of it, such as the text color, whatever words you have inside of there, and that kind of stuff. So just keep that in mind moving forward. Now that we have this, we can move forward and add some text buttons into the frame. So I'm going to do the same thing by making sure that we are using offset, or that we are using scale, and we are removing any offset from its properties. I'm just going to do 0.1, 0, and now I can adjust its size, and we can duplicate this from here so we can speed up the process later. So I am going to rename this button to primary. I'm going to make sure the text is scaled and change the text in here to say primary. I'm actually going to rename the button to say primary button. And this is going to be, again, for the customized loadout part of the video. So if you are only using preset loadouts, then you don't need to worry about adding these two buttons into here. So I'm going to change the second one to be called secondary button, and I'm going to change the text property again to say secondary. And now that we have these two, I'm going to duplicate one of them by holding Control D or Command D if you are on Mac. And now I am going to put buttons down here which will be the actual items or loadouts that the player will be able to select. So I'm going to change this loadout to be called Swordsman. And I'm going to change the text to be the exact same name as the actual button. So as you can see down here, the text property says Swordsman, and the name of the text button also says that. So make sure you do this because this will be really important for later in the video when we're writing the script. So I'm going to duplicate the button again. I'm going to call the second one Brick Battler and change the text in there to match up as well. And now that we have these buttons here, let's add one more into the screen GUI, which will allow us to turn on and off this GUI right here so we can get it off of the screen later. And now you don't need to add this part in if you don't want to. Like for example, if you are having it only show up on the screen and only be able to change it when you are on a certain team, like let's say you go to the lobby and you have to select a loadout before you are able to go into the game, then you probably don't need this button. And if you're wondering how to do that, I have a separate tutorial on that for team only GUIs that you can find through the card at the top right of the screen if you are interested. So while I was talking about that, I renamed the button to menu. I changed the text inside to be called change loadouts, and that doesn't have to be that way for that. And that doesn't have to have that text inside. You can change it to whatever you want, but make sure the name of the button is menu so that when we start on the script inside of here, it'll be much easier to reference. So for right now, these are all the buttons and text labels that we are going to need for this part of the video. So I'm going to select the screen GUI, click the plus button next to it, and add a local script inside. If the text is too small or too big, you can hold Control on Windows or Command on Mac and scroll up or down, and you can change the size of the text. And we can get rid of what's in here and get started. We want to start by referencing the different things inside of the screen GUI so we can talk about it in the different parts of the script much quicker, and so that we can make things happen when people click buttons. So I'm going to start by referencing the screen GUI. So I'm going to say local screen GUI is equal to script.parent. So this is a variable, so we are making a word equal to something else, so that instead of typing something super long out every time we wanted to talk about it, I only have to say screen GUI. we are saying script.parent because the local script is directly inside of the screen GUI. So that makes the local script's parent the screen GUI. So everything else on the first layer of the screen GUI is also the same. So the frames parent is the screen GUI and the menus parent is the screen GUI. And if this is a little bit confusing for you, you can select the item, go into its properties, and it shows a parent property. So you can use that to reference this if you are getting a little bit confused. So after this, we are going to reference the menu, and then we'll reference the frame, which I am going to rename to main frame because eventually we will have separate frames inside of here to access the primary and secondary tabs of the loadout selection system. So I'm going to start by going to local menu is equal to screen GUI dot menu, and make sure the capitalization and spelling is the exact same for what you are making it equal to, but the name of the variable, so on the left side of the equal sign, can be whatever you want it to be. So because menu has a capital M here, I'm making sure to do the same thing here. So next I'm going to reference the mainframe. Local mainframe is equal to screen GUI dot mainframe, and just in case it doesn't exist yet when we are referencing this, I'm going to change this to wait for child. I'm going to put it in parentheses and quotation marks and put mainframe into there. So the difference between this is that it's going to look through the screen GUI and it's going to wait for something called mainframe for 5 seconds before continuing with the rest of the script. Now it should load in before it gets to this part, but we'll do this just in case. And now if it is showing anything in the output, such as infinite yield possible for mainframe, then that means that you have either spelled it wrong or that it isn't capitalized correctly, so make sure it matches up with your Explorer over here. After this, I'm going to reference the text labels folder, and then we can get started with the functions. I'm going to say local text labels is equal to mainframe.textlabels get children, and we're saying get children because we are going to get everything on the first layer of the text labels folder, and this is going to allow us to dynamically change the text inside later on in the video, and I'll explain that once we get to it. So now that we have this, we are going to start by writing the function that will allow us to click this button on the side to open or close the GUI. And if you don't have this button and you're not going to use one for this system, you can skip to the timestamp on screen where we start with the other functions. So now whenever someone clicks this button over here, we want something to happen. So we need to have something that's listening for whenever it is activated. So if I say menu.activated, now this is connecting it to an event. So whenever the menu button is activated, we want to connect it to a function so we can make something happen. So this ends the menu.activated function. The reason we are using activated instead of mouse button one click is that mouse button one click is limited to people who are using a mouse, or maybe even a trackpad for laptops and other devices. But when we are saying activated, that means that anyone who's on a mobile device or using a touch screen or maybe a controller for a console, they will be able to, or they should be able to, activate the button and have something happen without needing a mouse. So when this happens, I want the visibility of this mainframe here to change. So if we go over here, select the mainframe and scroll down to its properties, its visible property is what determines if it's on the screen or off the screen. So if I say mainframe.visible, so the visible property is equal to not mainframe.visible, it is going to basically act as a toggle between the two states. Because it is only true or false, so if it's true you can see it, if it's false or unchecked, you cannot see it, I can simply say not mainframe.visible, and it's just going to change it to whatever it isn't. And this prevents us from having to use a bunch of if-then statements to check what it currently is. So now we can continue with the other functions. So I'm going to create a function that will allow us to communicate with the server to change the player's loadout. Because if we're having everything be changed on the server, then that means that when the player spawns in, only the player will know what loadout they have selected, and the server, which is the game, won't know what items to give them. So we are going to need to use this to send something to the server. But in order to activate this, we need to write something else. And to prevent us from having to do something for every single one of these buttons over here and use a menu.activated, something like that, we are going to loop through all of the buttons. And to do this, we're going to say for I, comma, item in pairs. And now I is going to act as like the position in the loop, and item is going to be the actual item. So if we go over here, let's say text labels over here, this is position 1. The item would be the actual folder. And over here, primary button would be position 2. Item would be the actual button, and so on and so forth. So in order to access all of these things, we need to go through the main frame. So I'm going to say main frame, because we referenced it over here on line 3, colon get descendants, and I'm going to put these parentheses at the end. So this is going to get all of the descendants of the main frame, so everything that it contains. So that includes things on the first layer of the main frame, and anything else that you can open up folders or keep going down into until you reach the last layer. So when we do this, it'll access something even if it goes all the way through, all the way down here. So it'll access this animation even. And this is going to be used so that we can write one localized thing that can activate this function whenever any button is clicked. So I'm going to write do here. So for each item in there, it's going to do something. And this ends the for I, comma, item in pairs loop. So now we want to check if what is inside of the main frame is a button. So we are going to say if item colon is a text button. So remember, the item is the actual thing that is being referenced here and not the position in the loop. Then we want something to happen. So if it's a text button, then whenever it is activated, we are going to connect it to another function. So again, we can make something happen. So what we are going to do is send some data into this function so that eventually the script knows what the player wants. So I am going to reference a few different things in here. I'm going to move this then back here and do this. So then we are going to reference a few different things. So I'm going to create some variables. I'm going to say local frame is equal to item.parent and local text is equal to item.text. So because this item is referring to a button, if we click here, and again, if we go down to its parent property, it is directly inside of the frame. And if we click it again and we scroll down to text, it has a text property, and that is whatever shows up inside of the button. So we are going to reference these things so that when we do activate this change player loadout by saying the name of the function and adding the parentheses at the end, we can send this data into the function. So now what this is going to do is it's going to loop through everything inside of the main frame. If it's a text button, then it's going to reference whatever its parent is and whatever text it has inside. Whenever that button is activated, it is going to run the change player loadout function, and it's going to send the text and the frame inside. So now we can reference the text in the frame by typing in 2 parameters in here. So now whenever we say text, it's going to reference the first piece of data that was sent through, which is also text. And then the second one will be the frame. Now you can change the name of these to be whatever you want, but I'm just going to keep it the same so it stays consistent. Now this ends the item.activated function, and now this one down here ends the if item is a text button, then statement. So now we can scroll up here and continue writing the change player loadout function. So inside of here, I'm going to print for troubleshooting purposes whatever text and frame is being sent through, just so that we know if this function is even being activated, and so that's much more visual to see in the output. So I'm going to print, and I am going to send into this, let's just say sending, and then I'll add a space here, and I'm going to put 2 dots outside of the quotation marks, text, and I'm going to add 2 more dots, add another set of quotation marks, and add a space from a button inside of, now add a space and 2 more dots here, and I'm going to say frame.name. So what this is doing is it is using concatenation. So imagine these 2 dots as filling in whatever piece of data was sent through into the previous or the next set of quotation marks. And the reason we are doing this is because we cannot predict 100% which button the person is clicking and what frame it is inside of. So now, let's say I were to click the swordsman button, it is going to say sending swordsman from a button inside of main frame, because that is the frame that contains it. And now we can continue inside of here. So this part of the script is where we are going to communicate with the server to have something happen. But in order to do that, we need to have something that can be activated that the server will be listening for. So I'm going to go over here into the Explorer, and I'm going to add a script into the server script service. And along with this, I'm going to add a remote function into the replicated storage. So if I click the plus button, add a remote function, and I'm going to call it change loadout. I forgot to get rid of that one earlier here from some recording tests. So the reason we are using a remote function instead of a remote event to communicate with the server is because the server is going to send something back to the client or the player that will eventually be used to change what text is showing on the left side of the screen. So if I go over here, inside of this part, I am going to reference the change loadout function. And actually, just to keep consistency, I'm going to reference it up here. I'm going to say local replicated storage, because that is what is containing it, is equal to game get service replicated storage. And I'm going to say local change loadout is equal to replicated storage, wait for a child, and then put in quotation marks, change loadout, because that's the name of the remote function. So now, if I say in here, change loadout, invoke server, and then I put parentheses at the end, I can send through the text and the frame over to the server. And then we're going to add some more into this later. But now that we have started to communicate with the server script, let's open that one up and start here. So I'm going to get rid of the text in here, and I'm going to bring over the replicated storage and change loadout variables that we defined over here, because we're going to need to reference it to know when it is activated. So we are going to need a lot of different things inside of this script. To start, I'm going to create a variable for requirements. And this is something that we are going to use later, so I'm just going to write using this later. So we'll adjust this later on, but I just wanted to outline it here for the future. Now below this, we are going to create a function that will change the player's loadout, and this is what will be activated whenever the server is invoked, or whenever you activate the remote function. So I'm going to go down here, I'm going to add the parentheses at the end, and we can continue that one in just a moment. Below this, we are going to need another function which is going to actually give the loadout to the player whenever they respawn, because it's going to be something completely separate from this part. The player's loadout will only be changed whenever they click one of the buttons here. So we want to make sure that even when they respawn, they don't have to do that again just to respawn with the exact same loadout, because that would just get annoying and people wouldn't want to play. And then at the bottom here, we are going to have another function that will activate whenever someone joins in order to give them a couple of different values. So at the top here, I'm going to reference the players service. So I'm going to say local players is equal to game get service players, and this is the one that contains every single player currently inside of the game. So now if I say players.player added, I can connect it to a function and send the player through that. So whoever joined, I can now reference in this part of the script by saying player, and whenever their character is added into the game, so whenever they respawn as well, I can reference their character by saying character. So inside of the character add function right here, I'm just going to activate the give loadout function, and I'm going to send the player through it, and I'm going to label these ends. So this ends the character added function, and this one ends the player added function. And now we can move this down, because the most important part is going to be in this section of the function. So inside of here, we are going to create a few different things. One of the things we are going to create is leader stats, which is what we could use for, maybe we'll say, checking for a player's level before giving them a loadout. And that part isn't required if you aren't going to use that for your game, but I'll include it for an example. And the other things we are going to add in there are going to be values for the player loadout, so that whenever they respawn, the script will be able to check something to know what loadout or items they have chosen. So I'm going to start by creating a few different things. The first thing I'm going to create is a variable called Loadouts. And I'm going to make that equal to instance.new, so we're creating a new item. And I'm going to make it a folder so we can contain things inside of it. And now I'm going to make the name of the folder equal to Loadouts. And I'm going to change the parent of loadouts to be equal to the player. Now this isn't advised all the time because some might prefer to use module scripts to store certain values and data for the player, and that is good. I'm going to be using this method though, so that is going to be much more visual and easier for you guys to see inside of the Explorer. So just keep in mind that there are other methods that you could do this. Now inside of here we are going to create a few different values. So I'm going to say local value1 is equal to instance.new, and I'm going to create a string value. And I'm going to make the value1.name equal to loadout, and I'll change it to a capital L. And I'm going to make the parent of that, value1.parent, equal to the loadouts folder. And additionally, I am going to change its default value. So this might be a little bit confusing, but here, if I go over here, I'm going to just add it into this, not there. I'm going to add it into the replicated storage for right now, but we're going to remove it soon. So this is a string value. Inside of its properties, it has a property called value. So this is what we are changing in this line right now. So it might be a little bit confusing, but we are changing a string value's value property to equal something. So I'm going to make it equal to the word loadout as well. Or in this case, since they aren't going to start with a loadout, I'm just going to leave it blank. So it's not going to be equal to anything. Or we'll just say, because I really want to add something, I'll just say no loadout. That's what we'll leave it at. And now eventually we're going to add more into here. So now that we have these two, let's just add the leader stats really quick. And if you don't want to add leader stats, which is basically, again, a leaderboard that has different things on it, you could put levels, you could put experience, whatever you'd like. If you don't want to see that, then skip to the timestamp on screen and we'll continue with the other functions. So now I'm going to follow the same sort of principle as this. So I'm just going to copy paste this over up here, and instead I'm going to name it to leader stats, and I am going to change this here, so the name of the leader stats will be something else. We're going to change it to be equal to leader stats with a lowercase l, and again we are parenting it to the player. And now I'm going to copy paste this over here, and I'm just going to change it around a little bit again. So instead this is going to be, I'm just going to call it level, so I'm going to paste this over here. So we are going to change the name of an integer value, so this can only contain integers or whole numbers. So I'm going to change the name of this to be level. The parent of this is going to be inside of leader stats folder, and the default value is going to be 0. So now we have two different things here. So this is going to be for leader stats, this is going to be for the loadouts, and I'll just write a comment down here below just so that it can be distinguished. So above is for leader stats and below is for the loadouts. So now that we have this part added, I'm just going to go over the top here and I'm going to hit play. There might be an error or two somewhere because we might not have finished the local scripts yet. And I'm just going to show you where those different values are going to show up. So over here, as you can see at the top right of the screen, we have a level property inside of the leader stats. If I click the change loadouts button over at the left side, I'll be able to toggle between these two. If I click one of the buttons, it does print out whatever it's sending. And now if I go over here and I open up the players service, I open up my player, I will have the leader stats folder that has the level, and I will have the loadouts folder that currently has a string value that says we don't have a loadout selected. So again, this is where you will have the values stored for the sake of this tutorial. So now I'm going to click stop at the top and we can continue writing. So now let's start writing the requirements so that we can go and work on these functions. So inside of here, I am going to create what is called a dictionary. So we are going to start by creating these brackets, which you can find next to the letter P on the keyboard. At least I think that's how it is on most keyboards. And if you hold shift and you click it like the left or right brackets, then you will get this fancy looking one instead. So now I'm going to go down a few lines in this and we can start writing. So inside of here, we are going to write two separate things. We are going to put in brackets the name of the loadout. So this one's going to be swordsman, and we are going to make it equal to something else. So in this case, we'll have it be a number. So it's going to be equal to 1. Now you don't need it to be equal to anything if you don't want it to, because this is what we are going to use to define a level requirement in order to use a loadout. So in this case, whatever is on the left side is known as a key, and the one on the right is known as a value. So we are making a word, the name of the loadout, have a requirement that we can check for later on in the script. So now we can separate these by adding a comma afterwards and then writing in the next thing. So the other loadout we have is Brick Battler, and we're just going to make that equal to level 5. And right now it's just going to be 5, but later we're going to check the player's level to see if it is is equal to the number listed here. So you can make this equal to whatever, like 5 gold, 5, whatever you'd like. So I'm going to add to this more later on, but now we can begin the change player loadout. So in order to activate this, we need to listen for whenever the remote function has been activated from the client. So we are going to reference it up here, change loadout. So change loadout dot on server invoke. So whenever it is activated, basically, whenever it is invoked from the client, we are going to make it equal to the name of a function. And this is a little bit different from remote events. And this is because we are binding it to a function. We're basically linking it together. And now make sure when you are doing this that the name of the variable or the name of the remote function is completely different from the name of this function that will be used to change the player's loadout. So if we said change player loadout is equal to change player loadout, then I don't think that it would work properly. So just make sure that these names right here are different from one another. So inside of here, since we are sending the text and the frame through, we are going to reference that accordingly inside of here. So now whenever a remote function is activated, it by default sends the player through as the first parameter, and the ones after that are going to be the text and the frame that we sent through. So after here, I'm going to put text and I'm going to put frame. So I'm going to label this end here. So this ends the change player loadout function, and now we can continue. So inside of here, we are going to print the player.name. So we can figure out who activated the function. And then we are going to put after here quotation marks and say sent, add another space, 2 dots, and then we'll put text, 2 more dots, to the server from, and then we are going to put frame.name. So now whenever the function is activated, remote function, it's going to print the player's name that activated. It's going to say they sent whatever text into it to the server, and then from that frame. And again, this is just for debugging purposes, so we could see it show up in the output. So now what I'm going to do is loop through the requirements, because that's the first thing that we want to check for. We want to know if what they sent through is actually a loadout, and then after that we can again check if they meet this certain value, but I'll do that after. So I'm going to start by saying for name, comma, requirement, in pairs, and then I'm going to put the name of the table or dictionary, which in this case is requirements, and we are going to do something. So this ends the for name, comma, requirement in pairs loop. So for each of these things, we are going to check for something. So we are going to see if the text that was sent through is equal to one of the names of the loadouts inside of the dictionary. So now if I say if text is equal to, so these 2 equal signs is checking if something is equal to something, while 1 equal sign is going to make it equal to. So if the text is equal to one of the names, then we are going to make something happen. So I'm going to say ends the if text is equal to name, then statement. So then if this is the case, then if the name of the frame, so if frame.name is equal to main frame, which is what is containing both of those buttons that are potential loadouts, then we are going to make something else happen or check for another thing. So now we are going to change the loadout value. So if we go down here, remember that we created this thing called loadout that will go into a folder called loadouts inside of the player. So I can now go here and say then player, because it's going to reference the player that activated this, dot loadouts, so the name of the folder, dot loadout, and I guess here, let me just change this to a lowercase l, just so it'll be a little bit easier to distinguish. Now we could say dot value. So the value property of the string value that is called loadout inside of the loadouts folder, inside of the player, is going to be changed to equal something else. So we are going to make it equal to name. So whatever the name of the loadout was. And then along with this, we are going to return something. This is why we are using a remote function. So then we are going to return whatever we just changed. So we're going to send that loadout back. And this right here ends the if frame.name then statement. So now let's give this a little test. So if there's anything that's going to go wrong, then we're going to debug it from the output, from the messages that we get. So again, we have the change loadouts button right here that'll do this. We have the level right there, And if I click on swordsman, it sent the swordsman from the button inside of the mainframe, and now we sent this over here to the main function. So we know that's working. And actually one thing that we did forget to do was to check on the client what value was sent back. However, one thing that we can check is if we go into the players, go into my player and open up the loadouts, this value in here should now say swordsman. So as you can see in here, the value property is swordsman, so we know that it did work. Now we just need to change the text over here at the left side in order to say what loadout we have. So instead, I'm going to change this right here to a variable. So I'm going to say local new loadout is equal to activating the remote function and sending the text in the frame through. So now what I'm going to say, if new loadout, or actually I'm going to loop through the labels because this will be really important when we get to the customized loadout. So I'm going to say instead for I, comma label in pairs, and I'm going to get the text labels variable up here. We are going to do something. So this ends the for I, comma label in pairs loop. So for each of those labels, we are going to check something. So if the label is a text label, just in case something is inside of that folder that isn't a text label, then we can continue on with this function. So this ends the if label is a text label, then statement. So if that is the case, then what we could do is actually we add one more thing this. So if it is a text label and the new loadout name is equal to the name of the label, then what we could do is change the text of the label. So the text value, or sorry, the text property of the label. So in this case, the one that's set up for this one is no loadout selected. So we are going to change what shows up in that text label to whatever the value of the result is. And sorry, to whatever the value of the new loadout is. So this is the result that is returned. So now if I hit play and I were to select this here, it actually didn't work. So we got to change one more thing in here. Oh, actually, the reason why this wasn't working is because the name of the text label is loadout with a capital L. So we need to change that to a lowercase l, because in the main script, we defined it as having a lowercase l. So now, if I were to go in here and hit play, and I were to click this button, now it changed it to say swordsman. So if I changed it to brick battler, it is going to change the name of that accordingly. And as you can see over here, the blue tab over here is what was printed on the client, so in the local script, and the one in yellow or green is the one from the server. And sorry, I'm colorblind. So that is the one on the server. So now we have that working accordingly, and we can continue to the next steps. So now let's go back over to the Explorer and let's add some things into the server storage. We are going to store the different loadouts in here. So just for reference, we have the Swordsman and Brick Battler loadouts right now. So in the server storage, I am going to add a folder, and the name of the folder is going to be called Loadouts. Inside of this folder, I am going to store some different items. So I'm going to go grab over here from the lighting, which you shouldn't use to store anything, but this is just for the tutorial. I'm going to store some different things inside of here. So first, I'm going to add some folders into the Loadouts folder, and I'm going to change it to Swordsman, and the other one I'm going to change to Brick Battler. So for the Swordsman loadout, I'm going to allow them to have a classic sword, and let's just say we'll give them a skateboard as well. But for the Brick Battler kit, I'm going to give them paintball gun, super ball, trowel, and we'll just leave it at those for now. Oh my god. And then we'll just leave it at those for right now. So now we have these two different loadouts that have some different items. So now I'm going to go back into the main script, and we're going to define a few other things. I'm going to say local server storage is equal to game get service server storage, and local loadouts is equal to server storage, wait for child loadouts. And I'm going to make sure that there's nothing else that says loadouts in the rest of the script here, or at least nothing that would refer to it directly as loadouts. So there's some right here, so just in case it accidentally goes here, I'm going to call it server loadouts instead. So now we'll just refer to it as server loadouts. And I'm going to add to the end of this :get children, so that we can get everything on the first layer of this folder, which is the Swordsman and Brick Battler loadouts. So now after this, we are going to go down to the give loadout function, and this ends the give loadout function, just so we know for later. So inside of here, this is what we want to activate in order to give the player the correct loadout. So inside of here, I'm going to define a few things. For one, we are activating it whenever someone respawns right now. So I'm going to change the first parameter in here to be player because that's what's going to be sent through from that function. So we know that this is the player that's respawning and we need to give them a new loadout. So inside of here, I am going to start by saying local player values is equal to player colon wait for child, and then we'll put into quotation marks here and we'll write the loadouts folder. And I'm going to do colon get children once again so we can turn it into a table. After this, I'm going to define their backpack. So is equal to player wait for child, and then we'll put in here backpack. And the backpack is where any items are contained within the player in the toolbar at the bottom of the screen if they do not have it equipped. So now below here, I'm going to reference their character by saying is equal to player.character or player.character added colon wait. And the reason I'm doing this is just in case for some reason the character has not loaded into the game yet, or if you were to activate this function separately without having them respawn, maybe if they were to click a deploy button. And the reason we are doing this is for a couple of reasons, and one of those is going to be to reference their humanoid so that we are able to unequip their current tools that they might have selected. So now we're saying character colon wait for child humanoid because we want to wait for something called humanoid inside of their character before we continue going. And now I am going to create a loop. So I am going to loop through the loadouts folders, or I'll just do loadouts folder in pairs, and then I'm going to put the name of the table. So up here we named it server loadouts. So I'm going to scroll back down here, change it to server loadouts and do. So ends the for I comma loadouts folder in pairs loop, and now we can continue. So now inside of this loop, we are actually going to loop for something else. So we are going to loop through the player value. So I'm going to say for I comma player value in pairs, and now we are going to loop through the loadouts folder inside of the player, and this contains all of the values. So I'm going to say do, and if this is a little bit confusing, I'll show it again once we spawn into the game later. So this ends the for I comma player value in pairs loop, and now this is where we will be able to check what loadout they have. So now I'm going to say if player value dot name, so if the name of the string value that's for their loadouts is equal to, and actually this is something that's only going to be applicable for the custom loadouts later, so we can change this a little bit. So instead it's going to be if player value dot value is equal to the loadouts folder dot name. So because we are making the value equal to whatever the name of the button was here, or the text, and since we have that the same inside of the actual loadouts folder, we are going to check if the name of the folder is equal to the value of their loadout. And again, this might be confusing, but we will continue explaining. So if that is the case, then we are going to continue. So this ends the player value dot value, the if player value dot value, then statement. So now we can create a variable that's going to check for something else. I'm going to move this then back here. So now I'm going to say local new loadout is equal to that loadouts folder that we found colon get children, so we can get all of the items on the first layer of that folder. And then from here, we are going to loop through this loadout. So now I'm going to say for I comma item in pairs, I'm going to say new loadout. We are going to make something happen yet again, and this right here ends the for I comma item in pairs loop. And now we can define a few things inside of here. So I'm going to say local clone is equal to item colon clone. And this is going to create a duplicate version of the item in there, so that once one person gets the loadout, it's not like that's the only one in the entire game that people will be able to use. And now next, I'm going to say local backpack check is equal to character find first child with the name of that item. And then I'm going to do the same thing except with the player's character. So now, and sorry, I just realized that was the character check. So that's character check. Now we are going to do a backpack check. So backpack, find first child, item.name. And these things were defined right here, a few lines up. And the reason we are doing this is because we don't want to give them the item if it already exists inside of their character or inside of their backpack. So now I'm going to go here and say humanoid unequip tools, and then I'm going to put these parentheses at the end. And this is going to make sure that any tools they have equipped are unequipped, so it goes directly into their backpack when this happens. And now we can do one of the final checks. So I'm going to say if item is a tool, which is one of the item types that allows someone to equip it in game. And if you aren't using a tool, like let's say you put a model into there, then this is not going to work because you will need to have custom logic for it. So make sure that you are using a tool and that there is something directly inside of that tool called handle with a capital H, or else it cannot be equipped. I would suggest testing this by putting the item into the starter pack before doing any of this part right here to see if you are able to equip it anyway. Because if you can't equip it even when it gets put into the starter pack and given to everyone, then that will show that there's something going wrong that's aside or completely separate from the script. So now if the item is a tool and not character check and backpack check, or we'll just say and not character check or backpack check. So if it's not in their character or in their backpack, then, so we could put that there. Then what we want to do is make clone.parent is equal to backpack. So now this is going to make the cloned version of the item and put it into their backpack. So this is going to end the if item is a tool, and not character check or backpack check, then statement. So now at this point, we should be able to get given the correct tools from each loadout whenever we respawn to the game. So now if I select swordsman and I reset, we get given the sword and the, oh sorry, that was kind of loud. We get given the sword, that's the wrong thing. We get given the sword and the sadly broken skateboard, and that is from the skateboard, so ignore that error. And if I go on over here onto the server and I open up the server storage, inside of the swordsman loadout, we do have the classic sword and Roblox skateboard. But now for the brick battler loadout, we have a paintball gun, super ball, and trowel. So now if I go over here, let's clear the output. I'm going to change my loadout over here to Brick Battler, and actually, I forgot we need to change one thing to make sure that this screen GUI doesn't reset on spawn. Now I'm going to change it to Brick Battler and reset over here. And now we get given those 3 items. And now again, this thing right here is completely different. This is from something else inside of either one of these scripts here, or it's probably the paintball gun. So we can ignore that error. So now that we know that the loadouts work, let's change one thing to make sure that it doesn't reset on spawn, or else their loadout is going to show up like that each time. So I'm going to go over and select the screen GUI and disable the reset on spawn property. So now it is not going to reset to its default text when you join the game when you respawn. So if I set this to swordsman and I reset, it is going to stay swordsman. And if I reset it to brick battler, do this, it will stay at Brick Battler even if I close the menu and do this. So now we can add requirements to this. So up here, I am going to go over onto this part. So requirements, remember, we could say level 1 is a requirement for the swordsman loadout and level 5 is a requirement for the Brick Battler loadout. So what I'm going to do is go down here. So if the text over here that was sent through to this function has the same as the name of the loadout and player.leaderstats.level.value is equal to 1. So if we scroll down to the bottom of the script, we created a leader stats folder right here that has a lowercase l, so that's the folder. And inside of that, we create an integer value that contains numbers that is called level. And we are checking for its value property, which will show what level the player is. So if we scroll back up here, so now, and actually, sorry, this is incorrect. I don't want to put 1. I want to put is equal to requirement because it could change depending on what loadout we have. So if the text is equal to the name of the loadout and their leader stats level is equal to the requirement, then they will continue on with the rest of the script to check if those things are true or not. So now if I go over here and hit play, now I should not be given the swordsman kit. So if I click this, it is now saying attempt to index node with name. And this is likely because it didn't return something to the function over here. So down here, I'm just going to put else print nothing happened, and we'll just leave it at that for right now in this part. So if we go over here and we hit play again, and I try to click on swordsman, and it's probably still going to do that, but that's okay for right now. But as you can see, it did not change my loadout. It sent those two things through, but if I go over here and swap to the server, and now if I go over to my leader stats folder, and I change this to 1, so now when I play in here, my leader stats level is 1, and I click on swordsman, now it changes my loadout because I met the requirement. Oh, so it's showing this nothing happened because we did it inside of a loop. So it looped through all the other things that were not applicable, and so that's why that one printed. Okay, so we could fix that soon. But now, if I reset, I am going to get given the swordsman kit. But now if I click on brick battler, it is not going to change it because I'm not level 5. So if I go back over here, go and change this level over here to level 5. Now, if I try to swap to it, it's going to go to brick battler and do this. But there is one slight error with this. Let's say I wanted to change it and I'm level 6. Or let's say, let's just say I'm level 5 and I want to go back to swordsman. It's not going to work, and the reason that is happening is because we're just checking if it was equal to the requirement. So in this case, we want to check something different. We want to see if it's greater than or equal to the requirement. So now that we have this, if I go back over here and I click on play, when I try to select the swordsman loadout, and I have a level that is higher, or I guess greater than or equal to the requirement, which in this case is 1, I will now be able to equip the loadout. So if I click it, it's going to say swordsman, and if I click brick battler, it is not going to change my loadout. So now I can go over here and I can click stop and we can continue. Now this is the point where we can get to creating customized loadouts where each player is able to choose different items. So now we are going to make some changes to this script. So if you are just looking for preset loadouts, then the previous part of the video should cover all of that. And now keep in mind that I will have a model inside of the important links section of the description that contains what I show in this entire tutorial, but you will still need to change a lot of different things inside of it to make sure that it works properly for you. And now if you are not going to use the model, just take note that the customization features that we are adding now in this part of the video is just going to add on to what we have already created. So if you are looking to go through step by step with creating most of the local script and the script, then you will need to watch that part of the video first. But now that we've got that out of the way, we can start by adding different things here. So first, we are going to create new parts within the screen GUI. So we have these buttons for primary and secondary up here that we've been waiting to use for this part of the video. So in order to do that, I'm going to select the frame here, going to click the plus button on it, and I'm going to add another frame inside. I am once again going to make sure that we are only using scale and we have the offset set to 0, just like I demonstrated earlier in the tutorial, so that depending on the monitor size, it will be scaled properly so that each player will be able to see everything on the GUI, no matter if they're on a phone or on a flat screen TV. So I am going to make it take up this section over here. So I am going to scale it all the way over these buttons, and I'm going to get rid of those preset loadouts that we had. The reason I'm doing this is so that once we select these two buttons right here, we will be able to toggle one of the frames that has the items listed on it. So I'm going to go back into this frame, and I am going to change its background transparency to something like 0.7, just so we know how big the frame is, and then we can make it completely invisible later on so it looks like it's just a part of the normal frame. So I'm going to duplicate one of the buttons we have here by holding Control D or Command D on Mac, and I'm going to drag it into that frame. And now I'm going to adjust it a little bit so that we can have the different items we can select from in here. And I'm going to duplicate this button, and I'm going to add some right here. So now I'm going to rename this frame, and actually let's move it down here just a little bit. I'm going to rename the frame to be called primary, so we know that this is the frame that will be activated when we click this button. Now I'm going to duplicate it, and I'm going to name the second one secondary. So just so we don't get confused with which one we're seeing right now, I'm going to select the secondary frame, scroll down its properties, and disable the visible property. So now the secondary frame is completely invisible. And I'm going to customize what is in the primary one. So I'm going to change this one to the name of an item that I want to give. So I'm going to scroll over here. Let's see. So I have a couple of different things. Let's bring the laser finger pointers and let's put that into one of these buttons. So I'm going to name this top button laser finger pointers, and I'm going to change the text inside of it to match up with that. So now laser finger pointers. And for the second one, I am going to give a rage table. So now the rage table is going to be the second primary button. So I'm going to rename it to that. And I'm going to change the text to be the exact same. So now what you read in there is going to be the exact same. Now this is going to be important for later when we are setting up these loadouts. So now that I have this, I'm going to select the frame. I'm going to disable its visible property, and now I am going to enable the secondary frame so we can customize what is inside of this one. So instead, I am going to give this one a pinata. So we'll copy this over here, and we'll paste it over to the top one. So it's going to be the text property over here. Going to change the name of the button to be the same. And for the final one, let's add the decoy deploy, because that one's a classic one. We'll add that. So sorry for the warp point that we aren't going to use right now. So I'm going to change the second one to be called decoy deploy, and I'm going to change the text property inside of it to match accordingly. So now that we have this, I am going to disable, or I'm going to get rid of the background transparency on both of these. So I'm going to make it equal to 1. So now it blends in with the main frame. I'm going to do the same with the primary one, but I'm going to make this invisible first. So I selected the primary frame. I'm making it visible by having a check mark here for this property, and I'm going to make the background transparency go to 1. So now we are going to need to set up some things to make sure that these are only enabled one at a time. So I'm going to disable both of their visibility, so now you can't see either of them. And I'm going to open up the local script we have for this and write some functions that will turn it on or off. So I'm going to add right here in between the change player loadout function and the loop that goes through the main frame. And actually, wait, no, I can incorporate it over here into this script, or into this loop. So what this was doing earlier was it was going through the entire mainframe and getting all of its descendants. So it was looking from the mainframe and finding everything inside of it to the last layer. So that means it would get all of the text labels inside of this folder, it'd get all of the buttons inside of these frames, as well as these buttons that are directly inside of the main frame. So because when it is activated, we turned on the change player loadout function, what we could do instead is we could check right here before that happens. So now what I'm going to do is say if text is equal to primary, then I'm going to make the visible property of primary equal to true. So I'm going to say mainframe.primary.visible, because it's the visible property that we're changing, is equal to true. And then I'm going to add an else if in here that will say else if text is equal to secondary, then instead we are going to make the mainframe.secondary visibility equal to true. And along with this, we are also going to make sure that it changes the visibility of the other frame equal to false, just in case it's already active. So I'm going to say mainframe.secondary.visible is equal to false. And I'm going to do the same thing down here, except I'm going to make it the primary frame that is going to be false. And if any of this is confusing, because if you did just jump into this part of the video, it might be a lot to take in, you can feel free to leave a comment down below and I'll try to help you out as much as possible. So now this one is going to end the if text then statement. And inside of here, I'm actually going to get rid of this and I am going to put it down here. So I'm going to put an else statement instead. So if the text is not primary or secondary, then instead we are going to run the function that is going to change the player's loadout, which is what we want for whenever someone selects one of the items, and we are going to have to modify the main script in order to account for that as well. So now if I bring this over here, and if I go over here and I click on play, now whenever I click on primary, as you can see, we get given the primary frame, and whenever I click on secondary, we get given the secondary frame instead. And if I click it again, it's not going to do anything else. So now we are going to need to make it so that whenever we click these buttons right here, it is going to change our loadout here, and it will also let us know what primary we have selected and what secondary we have selected, just so it's not as confusing. So I'm going to click stop here, and we're going to add some more text labels into here. So I'm going to go into here and I am going to duplicate this one by, again, Control D. I'm going to take all of these out of the folder here and drag it into the main frame so that I can move their position, and I'm going to drag this down here. So now this second one right here, we are going to call it secondary, and the first one we are going to call it primary as well. And then I am going to duplicate this label right here so that we can have it say whichever one it is for. So I'm going to say primary header, and I'll change this here. And I'm going to change the text inside to say primary. And then I'm going to duplicate it and put it down right here and change it instead to say secondary header. And then I'm going to change the text property to say secondary. So now the player will know that, okay, their primary item is going to be right here, and their secondary one will be right there instead. So now I can drag all of these text labels back into the text labels folder and we can continue working. So now I'm going to go into the main script and we're going to need to change a bunch of the requirements here. So I'm going to go back over here. So we got the laser finger pointers, pinata, rage table, and the decoy deploy. And those are all the items that we'll be using. So I'm going to drag it over here into the loadouts, and I'm going to drag these back over there just so that we don't have to worry about it interfering with this. So I'm going to change the names of these folders to be primary and secondary. And now these are the ones that are going to be containing all of the different possible items that each player can select. So if you didn't watch the earlier part of the video, we created a folder inside of the server storage that we called Loadouts. Inside of there, we originally named the different preset loadouts that you could choose from. But now, since we are allowing the player to customize their loadout, we're just going to have primary and secondary because there isn't one or two or however many universal loadouts that people are limited to. And of course, it will be limited to the amount of different items and combinations you have, but that's besides the point. So I'm going to go in here and make sure to check which ones we have set up for each. So if I go over here and enable the primary frame, we have the laser finger pointers and the rage table for primary. So laser finger pointers and rage table, we put that into the primary folder because that is the two primary items we have. And the other two, I'm going to drop it into the secondary folder. So now that we know this, we can go and modify the main script. So inside of here, we created a dictionary, which contains a key, which is going to be the name of the item. And we added a value to it, which in this case, we are using as a requirement. So we're checking if the player level reaches that requirement in order to determine if they are able to equip that loadout or item. So inside of here, I'm going to change it to the different names of the items. So I'm going to change this one to be laser finger pointers. So I'm going to do the two primary items first. So laser finger pointers and rage table. Going to add a comma to separate them. And I am going to add two of these here. So equal to, I'll just do a number for right now, equal to a number. And now we are going to input the two secondary items into this dictionary. So decoy deploy, and then the final one is pinata. So make sure that you have the same names of the items inside of this part of the dictionary that match up with the name of the tools. And also that has to match up with the name or with the text that shows up on the buttons inside of the frame as well. So now if we go back over here, we can set up the different values. So I'm just going to do 0 for right now, just to show you that we can equip all of these different items, and then I can input that later on. So now that we have this, we need to go all the way down to the bottom of the script and add a few more values. So originally, we created one single string value that was for the player's loadout, and that value determined what loadout they would be given when they respawned. But because we have a primary and secondary item, we cannot base it off of one loadout. So what we're going to have to do is create a second one. So with this one, I'm going to keep it as value 1, but instead I'm going to change its name to be primary, and I'm going to keep the value the same at no loadout. But then for the second one, I'm going to rename the variable to value 2 so that it can be something completely separate. And then I'm going to change its name over here to say secondary instead. So now it's going to create a primary and secondary string value inside of the loadouts folder. And now we can go back up into the script, and this is where we will need to change a bunch of different things. So before we get into the give loadout script, let's go on over to the change player loadout one. So over here, we looped through the requirements dictionary up here. And then if the text that was sent through from the local script is equal to one of the names of the items or loadouts over here, and their leader stat level value is greater than or equal to the required level right here, and this you don't need if you're not checking for leader stats, then we got to this point. So now this is checking for the frame name. But in this case, we have none of these inside of the main frame. They're inside of something else that is inside of the main frame. That might be confusing, but if we go back over here to the local script, when we sent the data through this initial function that ran whenever a button was clicked, we sent the item's parent. I know I'm losing some of you guys right now. You're like, what is this dude talking about? So here, let's take it slow. If I go over here into the primary frame, I'm going to click one of the buttons. If I scroll down to its properties, it has something called a parent. And this is whatever is directly holding the item. So in this case, for these buttons, they are inside of the primary frame. So that means what is being sent through to the server script instead is going to be either primary or secondary. So now we could go back over to the script and account for this. So instead, if frame.name is equal to primary, and then I can add an else if statement in here. So else if frame.name is equal to secondary, and you can do this for as many frames that you would like, then we can make something else happen here. So instead of changing the loadout value, we are going to change the primary value, and then we are going to return this one instead. And then we could do the same thing right here, except that we are going to change the secondary value and make it equal to the name of the item. And then down here, we are going to return the secondary back to the local script. So now we have this, we are correctly changing the player's loadout value whenever they select one of the buttons. But now we need to make sure that they are given the correct items. So now we must go over here to the give loadout function. So in this one, we are going to need to change a couple more things. And that mainly stems from this part right here. So now we want to check if the name of the player value is equal to the folder's name, because what we are creating inside of the player is a primary and secondary string value. And this is because if we go on over here to the loadouts folder, inside of it we have primary and secondary, and those are the same names as the string values. So we are going to check for that instead. So then if it finds the correct folder, then their new loadout is going to be, or I guess it could be new item in this case, it's going to be one of these items. So now we can loop through that folder, and then we can add another check into here. So we could say, now if player value dot value, so this is going to be the name of the item, is equal to item.name, now we can clone it into their backpack and do these different things. I'm also going to need to highlight all of these, hit tab to indent it one more. I'm going to need to add another end, and now all of these are actually going to be shifted over by one. So I'll label these later for the model that I put into the description that contains all of this. So do not fear. Anyway, and I can actually move this then back over here, and it'll be nice and dandy for right now. So now if we go back into the local script, we are going to need to change another thing right here before we check to see how it works. And actually, I think that this one might already be suited for how this is going to work. So let's just go in and hit play and test it to see if it changes it properly here. And if it doesn't, we're going to go back into the script and troubleshoot it to see what might have went wrong. So now I'm going to click on primary here, and I'm going to select one of these. So perfect, it changed the primary text label there. If I change it to rage table, it's going to change the primary text label as well. So if I go over to secondary now and I select the piñata, now it's going to change it inside of the secondary label. And if I change it to decoy deploy, it's going to do that as well. So now when I respawn, I should get the rage table and decoy deploy in my inventory. So if I do that, it got those two things, and those errors are from completely different things. Those are inside of the actual tools itself. But as you can see, I got the rage table here. That was a glorious, glorious gear from many years ago in Roblox. And I also have the decoy deploy, which I don't think it works anymore. But now if I were to change my loadout, let's say instead I wanted the piñata, and then we'll just keep the rage table for right now. And I reset. So now instead I have the piñata. Yay, he's so happy, dude. Look at him go. But now if I wanted to swap over to this for my primary, I can go over here, click reset, and now I have the laser pointers, and I could send my characters off the map over here. All of them, they can fly away, and yeah. So now we have a fully functioning loadout system with preset loadouts or customized loadouts that you can use to your liking. And now the reason why I am not showing multiple saved loadouts that are customized, so let's say we use the preset loadouts method earlier where you selected the loadout and you got given a bunch of different items, but instead, let's say you wanted to have something like Phantom Forces where you have multiple different loadouts at the top and then you could customize each one of them there. I will be doing that in a future tutorial, and that is because it would require data stores in order to save those loadouts across multiple sessions, even when people rejoin the game. And I haven't made any data store tutorial yet on my channel, so I want to make sure that I do that first so people get an understanding of it before I go and jump straight into that sort of thing. So I hope this helped you guys out. Make sure to check my tutorial playlist at the top right of the screen at the card there. That contains countless other tutorials where I do a same sort of thing where I explain in depth what you need to do and how it works. And then I'll also provide a model in the important links section that contains what I showed in that video, that also has written instructions just in case you take in information much better that way. And all of them are right over here right now as of making this video. And this tutorial took quite a while to do here. So because it's taken quite a while, if there is anything that I missed or forgotten that I don't bring up while I'm editing this video, if any text shows up on the screen, then please comment down below to let me know your question or the thing that I might have missed, and I can always update the description to let people know that there's a fix for something or something of that sort. And yeah, I'm tired. Hope that you guys have a great rest of your day. Hope to see you next time, and bye-bye.